My name is Brendan Augustine, and I'm the president of the Institute here in Western Australia. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land on which we are assembling tonight, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. I acknowledge their elders, past, present, and emerging, and I thank them for their leadership, custodianship of the land on which we are gathering tonight. Before I introduce our very distinguished speaker, I would also like to acknowledge a few people in the audience tonight. Members of the Diplomatic and Consular Corps, namely the High Commissioner of Canada to Australia, who happens by chance to be on her first visit to Western Australia, and I think her first visit to a state. Her Excellency Julia Sunday and her spouse, Mark, who are, as I said, on their first official visit to WA. The Consul General of Indonesia to Western Australia, and a member of the Institute, Ibu Listiana Operananta. Welcome. And the Consul of Italy to Western Australia, and a recent speaker at the Institute, my good friend, Mr. Federico Nicolacci. Also acknowledge the fellows of the Institute. I think we have one, apart from our distinguished speaker, our former president, and an icon in this university, Sue Boyd, who's sitting next to our immediate past president, Mr. John Goodlad, whom everybody in Perth knows. Huh? And the Honorary Consul of Colombia, sorry. Sorry, I forgot one honorary. Muy bien, señor. I want to recognize the support from two key partners as well tonight. Our sponsors of the evening, the Minerals Council of Australia, MCA, represented here by Mr. David Parker. And as well, our special partner for many of our monthly events, the Forest Research Foundation, whose director, James Arvanitakis, was supposed to be here. Was he here? I'm not so sure. No, he didn't come, but his team is up here. Can you please acknowledge them? They have been incredible supporters of the Institute, including a very, very full Monday night with overflow of people with the Ukrainian ambassador. I think we were all struggling to accommodate the crowd. I think it was a lesson. If we want a big crowd, get an ambassador from Ukraine. For many in the audience, and I can see quite a few of my former colleagues from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade here tonight, John Philip McCarthy does not need an introduction. And for others in the audience, you might have met John as part of his many diplomatic roles, where he always saw it as critical to engage with the broader Australian media and general community. I know Mark Parnell from the Business News, who is also here tonight, reminded me a few days ago that John was a regular speaker here in Perth as part of his previous roles. And for others, this event and our promotional material may have been your introduction to one of Australia's most preeminent former diplomats. I think, however, it is important that we take a few minutes to summarize this quite remarkable journey. Born in Washington, D.C., where his father was assigned as a senior representative of Australia's Department of Trade, John was always destined for an international career. Indeed, he studied in England, first at school and then at Jesus College in Cambridge, graduating with a Bachelor of Laws and an MA. Even before he joined the then Department of External Affairs in the class of 1968, he had worked in law both in London and New York. If I'm not mistaken, John, for a time at the Old Bailey in London, of Rumpole fame. You're trying to get criminals off the hook. Maybe.
I wasn't in the dock.
In his first assignment, often very defining for a diplomat, he was in Laos. At the time, the international story was the Indo-China conflict. Indeed, the development of Asia in the 20th and 21st century and Australia's role in it would remain a very prevalent theme in John's 40-plus year formal career in diplomacy. Between Canberra-based roles and diplomatic assignments in the 1970s and 80s, John served as senior private secretary, I think in today's terms we would call it chief of staff, to Foreign Minister Andrew Peacock. John's first of many ambassadorial roles was to Vietnam from 81 to 83. Subsequently, ambassador to Mexico from 85 to 87, Thailand 92 to 94, and the United States from 95 to 97, Indonesia from 97 to 2001, Japan 2001 and 2004, I'm running out of breath here, and finally High Commissioner to India from 2004 to 2009. This is indeed an impressive list, as one of his colleagues quoted in the press, and a very proud West Australian, Rick Smith, has said, he has probably been ambassador in more countries than any other Australian in history. But beyond just performing those key roles, John's time in some of those posts were truly historic. Probably none more than his time in Jakarta, when he witnessed the fall of the Suharto government and the transition of Indonesia to a vibrant democracy. And within that time, of course, the decision to grant East Timor a referendum, which led to that country's independence, and a lot of consequence and significance for Australia. Following his formal retirement, John has kept very busy. He has done periodic work for the Commonwealth, been on boards, a public intellectual on matters of foreign policy, and of course, a former president, national president of our institute. There are many reasons why I'm really thrilled this evening to be able to introduce our guest speaker, John McCarthy. Obviously, one reason is that as one of Australia's most experienced and preeminent former diplomats, his views on Australia and our role in the world are very much worth listening to. That is the raison d'etre for our institute. Another reason is the countries in which he served as our top diplomat are some of the most significant countries that impact on Australia's national interests. It is a privilege to tune into his experience of understanding how stakeholders in these countries think of us, how to shape their ideas and deliver outcomes for our national interests. Yet another is his experience working within the Australian political system. His insight into how foreign policy is made within a domestic political context have always been valuable, and we look forward to hearing about it tonight, either in his speech or if not, during the discussion afterwards. But for me, the most thrilling thing about introducing John tonight is personal. I was a young diplomat in Jakarta in 1997 when John arrived as ambassador. Even then, his reputation preceded him. We were both in awe, and I must say in a bit of fear of his famous exacting standards and reputation. Once I started working with him, it was well and truly confirmed there was a lot to be in awe of. His understanding of what was important for Australia and how to pursue it. And just only a little bit to be fearful of. But beyond his significant capabilities as a political analyst and a diplomat, from which I and many of my many colleagues sought to learn from, and indeed I WhatsApped many former colleagues, and they were very jealous they couldn't be here tonight. I will never forget John's support for a young, inexperienced, and slightly out of place diplomat that I was. I will never forget, many years later, by then serving at our Paris embassy, receiving a handwritten note from John while he was ambassador in Japan, congratulating me on my promotion, on a promotion. I will never forget as well some of the more interesting and exciting moments during the heady days of the late 1990s in Indonesia, at demonstrations and at meetings in way-off islands in the Indonesian archipelago, often hanging off John's shoulder as his interpreter, where he would be quite mischievous. John, can I welcome you to address the WA chapter of the Australian Institute of International Affairs. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. You're very kind. Okay, let me start by telling you what I'm going to say. I want to talk a little bit about what I think is the framework for Australian external policy and the particular challenges that Australian diplomats have. I'm talking about Australians particularly here. And then I want to go on a little bit and talk about the global challenges we and, of course, many other countries are facing today. Now, there's a lot I'm not going to talk about. I've only got 25 minutes or so, so please forgive me, and if I have glaring omissions, well, that's, I guess, all in the game. Okay, first of all, what's this country, when it looks externally, what's it think about? And there are basically three broad areas of foreign policy focus for Australia. The first is the region. It stands to reason that that has to be important to us. And we've only really worked on the region as a country in a serious way since the Second World War, because many people don't appreciate that until 1941, the British still had formal responsibility for Australia's external and defence policies. So it's really only after the Second World War we really got going in the region as an independent country. And it was a fascinating time because it was a region that had largely been colonised, and we were engaging with these countries as they left the status of colonisation. And particularly important, I think, in this category was Indonesia in the late 40s, where we played a very positive role to assist the focus of the Indonesian independence groups and recognise at a very early stage the Indonesian government. That's the first area. The second is the alliance relationship with the United States. That is something born of the Second World War, which has lasted the distance. Some would argue that there have been times when we have perhaps been rather too ready to pay what is often termed alliance dues to the United States in terms of military adventures in which we might best not have engaged. But nonetheless, it's a relationship that's lasted, and it's certainly, I think, thus far at least, been to our benefit. Now, the third area of external engagement for Australia has, of course, been what you might call our global interests, our multilateral interests, our relationships with, for example, the United Nations, what we do in the United Nations, what we do in regional organisations, what we do in the International Monetary Fund, what we do in the World Bank. That whole group of interests which Gareth Evans used to term as being where we should act as what he called a good international citizen. There are other terms, but you get the gist. And this isn't just, of course, when you say good international citizen, you're not talking here just about being benevolent. It is much more than that. It is a process of multilateral engagement which should take place to benefit Australian interests. Okay, so that's the broad framework of what we're about. Now, what's different about being an Australian diplomat to others? This is, a personal view which I've developed, and I think it's pretty right. This country is still a Western democracy. It's a multicultural country, but the way we work, the way we think, is actually based on the precepts of the Enlightenment in the 18th century. It is the underpinnings of Western democracy, and this country works on that basis. And that's, I think, a very important fact to remember. Where, however, we differ from other countries with a similar basis is that we are surrounded by countries with an entirely different historical background, except for New Zealand, historical background to ourselves, often different religions, different levels of development, which puts us, I think, in a very different position to most other Western democracies. And look, I always, when I think about this, use as two examples because the systems are reasonably similar. One is a country which is smaller than us in numbers, but very dynamic, and that's the Netherlands, which has got about 20 million people. And the other, which is bigger than us, but has a very similar system of government, which is Canada. Now, these two countries both have, and there are other countries, of course, I can include in that, as their primary focus, countries with similar backgrounds in terms of governance to themselves. The Netherlands' focus, of course, is on the rest of Europe. It would focus on the United States, which is really sui generis, and its issues would be in Eastern Europe primarily. It had, of course, been a colonial power, but now it's withdrawn to Europe. Canada, very similar country, bigger in terms at least of governance, the way the system works, but primary focus would have to be on its giant neighbour, and secondarily on Europe. Of course, it attaches importance to its relationships with India, Japan and China, but if you look at Canada's priorities compared with Australia's priorities, or the Netherlands' priorities compared with Australia's priorities, they're different in focus. Now this, I think, gives for Australian diplomats two areas of tension. The first area of tension is between our values and interests. Now, any country, when they're seeking to develop an external policy, must deal with both values and interests. Its interests are essentially, what makes the country work. Its security, its economic benefit that it derives from external relations. It's fairly clear when you talk about interests what actually you mean. Values, you're getting into much hazier, more difficult, more complex, philosophically areas. And values for us are essentially based on, as I say, the values of the Enlightenment, the values of a Western democracy. Now, we often have tensions between those because our relations with the region upon which our interests are based often come up against the value system which we as a democracy have. And it's a constant struggle getting that right. Now let me give you just a few examples of this. The major issues, or some of the major issues that have come up for us within the region have been values-based. For example, the issue in Timor is, Indonesia is our biggest neighbour. The issue of Timor is a case in point. The reasons why Australia took a particular position on East Timor was because of what we saw as our value system, which was in conflict with what we saw as happening in East Timor. Interestingly enough, from an interest perspective at that time, we saw our security interests very much tied in with East Timor remaining part of Indonesia. We didn't see it as in our interests that East Timor should be independent. And there was a real difference of opinion within the Australian system about that. In the end, the value system, or the values reasons, predominated. Essentially, we couldn't work as a country because of our system without taking the sorts of actions that eventually we took on East Timor in the 90s. So that's, just one case in point. The other conflict is between our history and our geography. Our geography is the region, it's Asia. We have a whole bundle of interests, economic and political, in what actually happens in Asia. But against this, we sometimes run up against this second area of preoccupation for Australia, and that is the alliance relationship with the United States. And you have to ask yourself whether at times we get these two elements, these two factors in our relationship out of balance. Ideally, in Australian foreign policy, you should have a balance between what you're doing in the region, what you're doing with all these countries, from Japan, China, Korea, Southeast Asia, and what you're doing with the United States because of our security perceptions. Now, the point here is you have to ask yourself the question as to whether at the present juncture we are not putting too little emphasis on global issues, too little emphasis on regional issues, and too great an emphasis on the security relationship. Now, there will be those that argue, but of course, the security relationship with the United States is based on regional issues, regional needs for Australia, defence essentially against China. Well, that's right. But the relationship with the United States also had us involved for many years in Iraq and Afghanistan, and from a regional perspective in Vietnam. So you have to worry, again, I'm repeating myself here, but you have to worry whether the priorities, the three basic priorities of Australian external policy have not had a tendency to get out of balance. And if you were the man in the moon looking down on Australia right now, you would see a situation in which the Australian public were far more focused and far more concerned about the alliance relationship with the United States and the impact on China and vice versa than on the other areas of the relationship, the other areas of primary focus. So those, I think, are the two areas of real tension in Australian foreign policy. However, having said that, I'd like to just dwell a little bit on what we have done in the region. And now I don't want to just roll off the usual, or rather tedious stuff about what we've done in international organisations. We've actually done a lot. We created this organisation which some of you would have heard of, others probably not. It doesn't actually sort of feature in the headlines much. APEC, a regional economic organisation. In a security sense, we've been involved in other organisations, the Quad, AUKUS, you will know about that. But we've done quite a lot in terms of what, in regional architecture, as it's called. But I'd like to use a couple of examples of where we actually have made the major difference, I think, in the region. The first was the Cambodia settlement, which for a lot of you is very distant. It's a settlement which took place in 1991, and it was effectively the end of the last chapter in the Vietnam Wars, which had really been a factor, the principal overarching factor in the development of Southeast Asia from probably the early 50s until 1991. Certainly, it was a major preoccupation for people in the Australian Foreign Service, the Indochina issues, as they were called. Okay, what happened with that was, with the Cambodian settlement, was that it had been in the winds. People had been talking of trying to sort out the Cambodian problem, which was derived from conflicts between various groups in Indonesia, in Cambodia, including the notorious Khmer Rouge and the group that is currently behind the present ruler of Cambodia, Hun Sen, or his son, is in fact the ruler. In the 80s, there had been a number of attempts to reach a settlement, but again, timing was everything. The Southeast Asians weren't ready to settle with Vietnam. The Americans certainly weren't ready to settle with Vietnam, although in Australia there were certainly pressures to try and do something about it. In the end, it was sorted out by the efforts of particularly the French and the Indonesians, but a lot of the heavy lifting, most of the heavy lifting on the settlement which allowed the end of the Vietnam War, the end of the Cambodian situation. In the end, that was the result, effectively, of the foreign minister at the time, Gareth Evans, who put an enormous amount of shoulder work in it. To give you some idea of the complexity of the problem, you had to get a settlement between the warring Cambodian factions. You had to get agreement of the Southeast Asians. You had Vietnam on one side, the other Southeast Asians on the other. And you had to get the agreement of the global powers. The Russians behind one group, the Chinese behind another group, the Americans behind another group, and everybody else wondering what to do. This was a mammoth task. It was done by Australia, largely with Indonesia and the French. And I'm not given to praising my superiors unnecessarily. But certainly, you have to give credit where credit was due to Evans and the person who helped him, a guy called Mike Costello. It was really very effectively done. And again, there were hardships along the line. The 80s, they were being turned back. Early 90s, major difficulties. But it was stickability and persistence which got us there. And although Cambodia is not today a happy country, far from it, that war, which had basically overshadowed the development of Southeast Asia for so many years, was ended. Now, the second issue, and I'm sure my colleague, if I may call her that, the Indian consul, won't mind my referring to our differences with Indonesia at the time, but the second issue was the Cambodian question. Sorry, the East Timor question. And as Brendan has mentioned, I was in Jakarta at the time. I just want to tell you a few things about that. You'll recall, or some of you may recall, that the whole issue of what to do about Timor came to a boil when Suharto left and when Habibie became president. He changed the premises for the future of Cambodia. He began talking much more openly about autonomy. Now, in Australia, we're under increased political pressure to do something about either obtaining major autonomy for East Timor or obtaining independence for Timor. I can assure you that none of us at the time thought independence was an option. There was so much pressure coming from the Indonesian military to stay there, and Indonesian occupation or integration of East Timor was just a fact of life. Well, a decision was taken in Australia that we had to move politically. And so a letter was sent to Habibie, which I delivered, which essentially proposed to the Indonesians that they have a referendum on East Timor to allow the East Timorese to choose between independence or autonomy. And Habibie's reaction was, what sort of choice is that? If you offer people a bicycle or a car, they're going to take a car. And he said, and the idea of having a referendum with one of the proposals in the paper was a long period of autonomy followed by a referendum. He said I would be holding a pistol at my successor's head if I agreed to that. Now, of course, I sort of reported that back. And here's one of these sort of strange sets of developments that sometimes can alter the course of national events. I knew this letter was coming at the time, this letter to give to Habibie. Canberra wouldn't tell me what was in it because they're afraid that I would send back messages saying this isn't going to work, which I would have done. and everybody agreed that it wasn't going to work. And the only safe way of communicating in these circumstances to save your political neck is by telephone with your colleagues in Canberra who don't want to put anything on paper. So I sort of rang people. I said, what's going on here? And they said, look, we know Habibie's not going to agree to this. What we propose to do is leave it for 2 or 3 weeks and then give it out to the Australian press as a change of position on the part of Australia. And I said, well, it's quite a big deal. Are you sure you mean this? Anyway, I did what I was told. One thing I didn't do, I had a strange piece of advice: take this straight to Habibie, miss out the foreign minister. And I immediately thought to myself, I've got to work with this man for another 2 years. I'm certainly not going to do that. So I got the message into Alitas. And, sure enough, what happened was we delivered the message to Habibie. Then, it was all off. He said, no, I'm not going to do it. This is not on. But there were forces within the Indonesian system who were talking to Habibie saying, look, maybe we should move on this independence issue. It's not doing us any good. Then one of these strange things occurred. When I saw Habibie, I put in a drop copy of the letter, gave it to him, all the rest. And I put it on the table, and that was the end of it. Then what tends to happen, probably outside government people wouldn't realise this, the real copy of the signed letter came in a couple of weeks later in the bag, the formal thing, the whole thing. It was before you could sort of send letters automatically and they come out perfect at the other end. It just didn't happen. So you got the signed letter and automatically you just put it into the system to be delivered to the president. Well, Habibie used to work late and the people in his office didn't realise that he'd already seen the letter. So they whacked it in and Habibie read it at 2 o'clock in the morning and said, well, maybe we should go with this. And he put an instruction to his cabinet, we ought to prepare the ground for a referendum. And that was it. And the cabinet agreed. And then it all happened. But of course, the Australian story is much more channeled to an Australian audience than actually what happened. For a start, for 2 or 3 months, Australian ministers were saying, well, we really don't know what we want. They weren't putting it quite that way, but they were saying, look, we think at the end it would be better if East Timor stayed with Indonesia. They said that for a couple of months. And then as the situation on the ground changed, the Australian government's public comments began to change too. And we were then talking about a referendum that was free and fair and so on. But the country, we would never, again, what you come back to were these sorts of occasions, timing is really everything. On Cambodia, timing was everything. We got the Cambodian settlement because the Cold War just ended, the Vietnamese had just pulled out of Cambodia. All these good things came together. In the Timor case, it wasn't a question of the good things coming together. It was more a question that at that time, and Australia didn't really realise this, the Indonesians were totally preoccupied with a whole bunch of issues, actually more important for them than East Timor. There's a change from authoritarian government to democracy. There was decentralisation taking place with this enormous country, pushing power out from the centre to the provinces. There wasn't just one military situation in East Timor that they were having to deal with. There were four. There was Aceh, Ambon, Sulawesi, and Timor. So, and minor issues in Kalimantan. So, you know, these people had enormous problems. And, you know, they really didn't focus on it to the degree that they perhaps should have, or they would have. Anyway, the rest, I guess, is history. But the point about it is, it was a question of timing and luck. It wasn't a question of well thought through Australian policy. We were hopping from issue to issue every 2 weeks. And it was an interesting and very tough time. There is a point, though, I want to make here about both the Cambodian issue and the Timor issue, which again, you know, we tend to forget in Australia. We were important because we were the prime movers in both these areas. And we put a lot of work into it, you know, a colossal amount of work. And both ministers have to be given credit for that, Evans and Downer on Timor. But the other factor, which people tend to forget, is that none of this would have been possible were it not part of a multilateral effort. The UN were heavily involved on both occasions, even though in Cambodia, the commanding general of the peacekeeping force, or peace-maintaining force, was Australian, John Sanderson. Never mind that the main contingent of the force that went into East Timor was Australian. The fact was, it was an international exercise, and it had to be done with the consent of the people on the ground. And in this case, it was the Indonesians and the East Timorese, and in the Cambodian case, it was all the different factions. So, you know, we are not a country that can just get involved in these major issues on our own. That's really something for very big powers. Maybe Americans, Russians, Chinese, French, until perhaps recently, the British, not so much now, but again, until recently, the permanent five. Okay, so those are the sort of two subsets, I guess, of this talk, the discussion on Cambodia, discussion on East Timor, because those were areas where Australia did actually make a difference, not just the talk. It was, you know, seriously made a difference. Okay, now, you know, given the sort of country we are, what are we facing now? Well, you're all very conversant with the turn that the relationship between China and Australia has taken over the past decade or so. And, you know, clearly, I think, and I've expressed this view, I think, you know, China's actions over the last 5 or 6 years have been, in many cases, quite bellicose. On the other hand, they do have interests. They're a major country. We have to realise they have interests. And I think some of the steps we took under the former government against China and the way in which we delivered those messages to China caused reactions which impinged upon our trade. I have no doubt about that. It was bad diplomacy that caused us many of the headaches. Some of those headaches would have come anyway. I'm not excusing the steps the Chinese took, but there's an old boxing expression, leading with the chin, which means, you're not wise to lead with the chin in diplomacy. And on China, we led with the chin. And it's a much bigger country, and we saw what's happened. Now, fortunately, that's been, I think, put into a better state of repair now. The issue now, of course, is what's going to happen with Trump too. And the world is going to be different, I can tell you that. Trump 1 sort of inured us to what was likely to happen with Trump 2. So people aren't so surprised. Stuff's going to happen, and there's an expectation that stuff's going to happen, and people are preparing for that. I mean, you might see the steps which the Europeans, the Canadians, and others have taken to deal with Trump themselves already. And we have to do that, one way or the other. Obviously, there are certain dangers. Bear in mind, when Trump came in 2016, it was actually a different world. There was the China issue was boiling up, and very much boiling up. But the Ukraine issue hadn't come to the fore, and Gaza was quiet, or relatively quiet. Now you've got a situation where you have 3 global hotspots, which will need very careful management. Now, you look at that Trump cabinet, and I'll make some comments on that, and you've got to worry. I mean, everybody's saying, oh, it might be quite as bad as we thought. Well, it might not be, but it's still not going to be good. Look at, first of all, the team. I think one's got to avoid there's a new word that's crept into the lexicon, catastrophize. We've got to avoid catastrophizing the Trump regime or administration before it comes in. And if you look at some of his cabinet nominations, they're not too bad. The Treasurer is accomplished, and he will have a considerable say in international economic policy. Rubio, the Secretary of State, one may not necessarily align oneself with his politics, but he's competent. The mooted Secretary of Defence, DeSantis, is competent. The person who is currently the nominee for Secretary of Defence has real issues. But it's when you, Chief of Staff, and it's an important job in the United States, quite good. So leaving aside the politics of some of these people, they at least will be able to do a competent job and in an accomplished way. Some of them. You look at a lot of the others, and it's truly worrying. And it's truly worrying. I'm talking here about the Homeland Security lady who shot a dog, Kennedy, the wrestling lady who is the minister, not actually physically doing it, manages a wrestling enterprise. She's the Minister of Education. The Attorney General, a Ms. Bondi, who succeeded the man who they couldn't pursue, who couldn't push forward for Attorney General. I mean, they're just not very good. And they're much worse than that. They are not really fit to hold public offices of that sort. Now, all this means you've just really got to wait and see. But I would suggest that there are 2 things we've got to watch in particular, which I think, well, 3 things which are particularly dangerous. One, ultra-aggression against China, both on the economic and political front. Fine, the United States has got to stand up for itself, its allies, all the rest. But an ultra-aggressive stance on China is not going to be in our interests because it's going to disrupt the region. So that's the first thing I think we've got to watch. And that includes, by the way, the talk of tariffs. I include that in that package. It's all very unknown and worrying. If there's any consolation at all, it's that 2 or 3 people, the National Security Advisor, Rubio, they are not going to make massive errors of judgment based on their personality. So that, at least is some advantage. The second risk I see is, and we don't know what the outcome is going to be here, is serious problems with their allies in Europe. Partly over the Ukraine, but partly just anyway. Bear in mind that the Europeans now, 3 or 4 countries are very, very closely linked into Russia. The Georgia, government of Georgia, government of Romania, new president of Romania, Hungary. It's not straightforward at all. And you have real problems, political problems in both France and Germany, and actually Britain's still recovering from its whole Brexit exercise. So Europe is not as strong as it was. Now, if you get an American government which effectively says, look, we're not all that interested in NATO, but if we're going to do something, you guys have got to pay a lot more quickly. If that sort of attitude prevails, it's not healthy. It's not healthy for the West, but it will be observed also in our region. And it will be seen as a lack of American commitment, and that will have implications for Chinese policies and the reactions of other countries in Southeast Asia. So I see that as a problem. The third problem I see is impact of developments in the United States on the global South. The global South is basically neither East nor West, it's basically everything else. What's used to be called the developing world, the Group of 77, the non-aligned movement were part of it, but it's that very large swathe of countries which tend to be economically behind the West and in a different category to China. Now, the global South are important to us because they are going to be influenced by what the United States does, and their approach to China will be influenced by what the United States does. And the West's lost out with the global South in the last 10 years or so. And I think they're probably, and particularly in the last 3 or 4. And I think there are 4 examples of this. First, Ukraine. The Americans and the Europeans sought to persuade all of the global South that we were right on Ukraine and they were wrong, and the Russians were totally wrong. Well, I think our view is actually, I think our perspective is pretty right. But that avoided the fact that Russian relations with important countries were actually pretty good, particularly, say, with India, with a lot of countries in Africa, some countries in Latin America, all pretty good. The Russians are capable diplomats. There are good economic reasons for those countries to maintain a strong relationship. And many of this global South, the so-called global South, said, look, you guys want us to support you on Ukraine. That's hypocritical. You went into Iraq, you went into Afghanistan. You're telling us that our interests, our major interests on debt, climate change and so on, you're putting then in a different order of priority to your own priorities. That's important. So that Ukraine had a big impact. Gaza, the charge of hypocrisy, resonated very loudly in the global South. And I needn't go into detail about that. Most people here be very well aware of it. But without my taking sides on the thing, you can understand how many countries reacted very adversely to the actions of the Israelis over the last year and the ongoing support, particularly by the United States, but also some countries in Europe, to a system or to actions which they saw as unfair. The third area was COVID, where there was a widespread perception in the global south, which hasn't been really picked up in the Western press, that in terms of the reactions of Western countries, particularly on the issue of vaccine distribution, they were left out in the lurch. That again has had a major impact. And the fourth factor, I think, is that China is not, necessarily embraced or well loved in the region at all, but they've been, reasonably shrewd. They don't tell countries how to run their affairs. We do, or certain countries do. That's seen as a positive. And many countries need China economically. It's growing, well, despite all its economic problems, it's growing and wealthy. So, those I think are the areas that we've got to watch now. Look, I've gone on long enough, and I think I better wrap up here, but I hope I've left you with some idea of what guides this country, the importance of maintaining equilibrium between the three areas of priority, and some of the things that are coming down the chute towards us, and some of the problems. But I think, we're going to, one way or another, over the next couple of years, think of the United States in a different way. I don't know how we do that. I don't know how it's going to develop. I'm not for a moment arguing that the relationship should not remain a strong one, but I don't think it's the old United States any longer. We've had a taste of it in the first Trump round. That sense is not just an administration, it's not just one man. The United States, thinking in the United States has changed over the last 10 years. And if we don't get that, we're nuts. It's our interests that count, it's not American interests. But Western interests are part of our interests. And so, we have to try and maintain that sense that the underpinnings of our values should be maintained in terms of our foreign policy profile. Okay.